January 17th, 1943, North Africa, zone 947 hours. Feet. The B-24 Liberator shuddered through flak, torn sky above the Tunisian desert. Feet. Hydraulic fluid streaming from her belly like arterial blood. Second Lieutenant Louis Zamperini. No, wrong war. Feet. Wrong man. Second Lieutenant William Lawley gripped the yoke with hands that no longer trembled. Feet. Because trembling required nerves that still functioned, and his had burned past fear into something colder. Feet. Through the shattered canopy, the Mediterranean sun poured in with obscene brightness. Feet. Illuminating the red mist that had been his co-pilot's face 3 minutes ago. The bombardier was dead. Feet. The navigator was dying, and the manual said nothing, absolutely nothing. Feet. About what to do when your aircraft becomes a flying tomb and the only airfield in range flies the wrong flag. This was not how American boys were supposed to die. The winter of 1943 marked the fulcrum point of the North African campaign. Feet. That vast chess game played across sand and stone, where Rommel's Afrika Korps traded blows with Allied forces in a mathematics of attrition. Feet. For the men of the 8th Air Force, recently redeployed from England to support Operation Torch. Feet. The skies above Tunisia represented a different kind of hell than the frozen altitudes over Germany. Feet. Here the air was hot and thin, the flat batteries, German-trained but Italian-manned, which meant unpredictable. Sometimes laughably inaccurate, sometimes devastatingly precise. On that January morning, Feet. Lawley's crew had drawn the ladder. Their target, the Axis airfield at Bizerte. Feet. A strategic choke point where Luftwaffe fighters refueled before hunting Allied bombers. Feet. The briefing had been routine, the intelligence photographs showing standard defensive positions. Feet. What the photographs had not shown, what no photograph could show. Feet. Was the new German flak regiment that had arrived 72 hours earlier, fresh from the Russian front. Feet. Veterans who had learned their craft shooting down Sturmovix in the killing fields of Stalingrad. V. Lawley's Liberator, christened the Warrior, took the first hit at Zura 944. Feet. A direct strike that turned the No. 3 engine into a torch. Standard procedure, feather the prop. Feet. Activate the fire suppression, maintain formation. But the second shell, Feet, arriving with the arithmetic precision of German gunnery, shredded the cockpit. The co-pilot, Feet. First Lieutenant Paul Cravens ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Feet. The blast wave drove bone fragments into Lawley's face and hands, peppered his torso with steel, and feet. In a detail he would remember with hallucinogenic clarity for the next 50 years. Feet. Embedded a shard of Craven's wedding ring into his left cheek. In the bombardier's station below, Feet, the glass nose had become a kaleidoscope of cracks. Through those fractures, Feet Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski watched his own blood pump onto the maps of Tunisia. Feet. Each pulse a red period marking the end of sentences he would never speak. The navigator, Lieutenant James McGuire, Feet, had taken shrapnel through both lungs. His breathing sounded like wind through a broken church organ. The manual, Feet. That sacred text every pilot memorized until the words became liturgy, said to maintain altitude, maintain formation. Feet. Follow the leader home. The manual assumed you had hydraulics. It assumed you had an airspeed indicator. It assumed your co-pilot was not decorating the instrument panel. Feet. The manual was written by men who had never tried to fly a four-engine bomber with one hand while holding their own intestines in with the other. Feet. Lawley had not been injured in the abdomen, but the metaphor held. The warrior was gutted. Feet. What the German pilots expected, circling like sharks scenting blood, was the oldest story in aerial warfare. Feet. The wounded bomber falling behind. Feet. The formation's discipline fracturing as some crews tried to protect the straggler while others, feet, governed by the mathematical survival instinct, maintained course. Feet. They expected the B-24 to descend in that telltale spiral. Feet. That death spin every Luftwaffe pilot learned to recognize. Sallows and feet. They expected to add another kill marking to their fuselages, another small cross painted beneath the cockpit. Feet. What they did not expect was for Lawley to do the unthinkable. Feet. 3 miles northeast lay the smoking city of Tunis, recently captured by Axis forces. Its airfield, feet still marked on Allied maps with red cross-hatching indicating enemy control, feet, possessed the only runway within the B-24's rapidly diminishing range. Behind, across the Mediterranean, lay Malta, feet, British, safe, and impossibly distant. Ahead lay the bomber stream returning to Biskra, to safety, feet, to hot coffee and the surgical tents where doctors performed miracles with sulfa powder and prayer, feet. Lawley turned toward Tunis. In the waist of the aircraft, Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, the flight engineer, feet, felt the turn and understood immediately what it meant. In the radio operator's station, feet, Staff Sergeant Eugene Reese stopped tapping his key mid-transmission. Feet. The Morse code trailing off into incomprehensible nonsense as he realized their heading had shifted 30 degrees off course. Feet. In the tailgun position, Sergeant Vincent Russo, isolated in his plexiglass bubble, feet, watched the rest of the formation continue eastward, while the warrior broke away like a wounded bird seeking earth, feet. The Germans had expected many things from American bomber crews, feet. They had expected the almost suicidal bravery of the Schweinfurt raids, feet, where B-17s flew into flak curtains thick enough to walk on, feet. They had expected the stubborn refusal to abandon damaged aircraft, feet. That peculiarly American optimism that believed engineering could overcome physics. What they had not expected, feet. What violated every tactical assumption they held, was for an American pilot to deliberately fly toward capture, feet. But Lawley was not flying toward capture, feet. He was flying toward the one thing the manual never discussed, but every pilot understood: die, feet. The unwritten contract that said you brought your men home, even if home was a POW camp, even if home was a stretcher in an enemy hospital, feet, even if home was a grave marked with a cross instead of scattered atoms across the Mediterranean, feet. Historical records from the period reveal a peculiar truth about American aircrew doctrine versus Axis philosophy, feet. German pilots, trained in the Prussian tradition of individual excellence, were encouraged to bail out of damaged aircraft. Survival of the pilot, that expensive, irreplaceable asset, superseded all other considerations. Japanese pilots, bound by Bushido's death, before dishonor code, feet, often chose to dive their burning aircraft into enemy ships rather than face the shame of capture, feet. American doctrine occupied a strange middle ground. The aircraft was expendable. The mission was expendable. But the crew? That random assembly of farm boys and factory workers, college dropouts and high school athletes. Feet. The crew was sacred. The manual never stated this explicitly. But every pilot understood you landed the airplane, feet, even if landing meant treason. At 09:56, the Warrior crossed into Axis-controlled airspace at 4 feet, 1,000 feet and descending. The hydraulics had failed completely now, which meant the landing gear would not extend. Feet. The flaps would not deploy, and the bomb bay doors, still partially open from the aborted drop, would not close. Feet. The aircraft had become a flying sieve, air screaming through 100 shrapnel holes. Feet. The sound like a chorus of the damned. In the cockpit, Lawley discovered a new problem. His vision was failing. Feet. The blood from his facial wounds had clotted in his eyes, reducing the world to red, tinted shapes. He could see the runway, could perceive it, at least, as a lighter strip against the darker earth. Feet. But the instruments were illegible. Altimeter, airspeed, rate of descent, all mysteries. He was flying by feel now. Feet. By the vibration of the yoke in his hands, by the song the wind sang through the broken canopy. Below. Feet. On the Tunis airfield, German ground crews watched the descending Liberator with confusion. Feet. The aircraft was clearly American, the distinctive twin-tail fins unmistakable. Feet. But it was approaching from the south, from the direction of friendly territory. Feet. Not from the north, where enemy bombers typically originated. Was it damaged? Obviously. Was it surrendering? Feet. The concept seemed impossible. In 2 years of Mediterranean warfare, no intact American bomber crew had voluntarily landed at an Axis field. The standing orders were clear. Shoot down all Allied aircraft. But something in the B-24's wounded approach. Feet. The way it wallowed through the sky like a dying whale gave the flak battery commanders pause. Feet. Perhaps curiosity stayed their hands. Perhaps some remnant of chivalric warfare. Feet. That obsolete code that said you did not shoot the man in the lifeboat. Feet. Perhaps simple shock at witnessing the unprecedented. At 1004, the Warrior touched down. Without hydraulics. Feet. Lawley had no brakes. Without functioning landing gear. Feet. The aircraft settled onto its belly in a scream of tortured aluminum. The bomb bay doors, still partially open. Feet. Caught the runway surface and tore away. The No. 1 engine, its prop frozen by battle damage, struck the concrete and shattered, pieces of blade whirling off into the desert scrub. Feet. The aircraft slid for 800 yards, hemorrhaging parts and fuel. Feet. Before finally grinding to rest at the runway's eastern end. For 7 seconds, nothing happened. Feet. Then the German troops, shaking off their paralysis, rushed forward. Feet. What they found inside the bomber would appear in Luftwaffe after-action reports with language that bordered on reverence. Feet. The American crew had continued to man their positions despite catastrophic damage and certain capture. Feet. The level of devotion to duty exceeded rational explanation. The bombardier was dead. Feet. The navigator died as they pulled him from the wreckage, his last words a request for someone to write his mother. Feet. But the other 7 men, including Lawley, were alive. Wounded, some grievously, but alive. The German medical officers, experienced in the carnage of the Eastern Front, later admitted they had not expected any survivors given the extent of the aircraft's damage. Feet. In the PW interrogation that followed. Feet. The German intelligence officers focused less on tactical information and more on the incomprehensible decision. Why had Lawley flown to an enemy airfield? The question was asked repeatedly, in different formulations. Feet. As if the answer might unlock some secret about American military psychology. Lawley's response. Feet. Recorded in captured Luftwaffe documents later recovered by Allied forces, was simple. I had wounded men aboard. Feet. They needed medical attention immediately. Your airfield was the only option. Feet. The interrogator's notation in the margin of the report read, Feet. Prisoner appears to believe his duty to his crew superseded his duty to escape capture. Feet. This represents a fundamental difference in operational philosophy worth further study. But while the Germans puzzled over Lawley's choice, Feet, a different drama was unfolding 400 miles away at the Allied airbase in Biskra, Feet. The returning bomber stream had reported the Warrior missing. Feet. The last visual contact described the B-24 turning away from the formation, heading northeast, Feet, toward enemy territory. Radio transmissions had ceased. The aircraft had vanished, Feet. Standard procedure dictated that missing aircrew be listed as MIA for 30 days before being declared KIA, Feet. But within 72 hours, German radio propaganda, always eager to trumpet Allied losses, Feet, announced the capture of an intact American bomber crew that had surrendered at Tunis. The broadcast, Feet, monitored by Allied intelligence, included details only the crew could have known: names, serial numbers, Feet, and the damning fact that the aircraft had landed voluntarily at an Axis airfield, Feet. The news reached 8th Air Force headquarters like a grenade, Feet. An American officer had flown his entire crew directly into enemy hands without being shot down. The aircraft had been intact enough to land. The implication was unavoidable: Lawley had surrendered, Feet. In the rigid hierarchies of military justice, surrender without exhausting all alternatives was treason, Feet. The manual was explicit: fight until the aircraft is unflyable, then bail out over friendly or neutral territory, Feet. Land at an enemy airfield only if forced down by enemy fighters and with no possibility of escape. Lawley had done neither. He had chosen to land at Tunis while his aircraft was still, technically, flyable. Feat, that he had landed to save his crew's lives, was irrelevant to the letter of military law. Feat, the court-martial convened on April 3, 1943, 3 months after the incident. By then, Feat Lawley and his surviving crew were imprisoned at Stalag Luft through Feat, the POW camp that would later become famous for the Great Escape. They knew nothing of the proceedings. Feat. The trial was conducted in absentia, Feat, a paper trial where prosecutors and defenders argued over mission reports and intelligence transcripts while the defendant starved on German rations 2,000 miles away. The prosecution's case was surgical in its logic. Feat. Lieutenant Lawley had deviated from the brief flight plan, Feat. He had turned toward enemy territory while other options remained available, Feat. He had landed at an enemy airfield without being forced down. He had surrendered his aircraft and crew to the enemy. Each fact, taken individually, was indisputable. Assembled into a narrative, they painted a picture of cowardice, Feat, possibly even collaboration. The defense faced a more difficult task. Feat. They had only the testimony of the other returning crews, Feat, who had seen the Warrior's damage but could not speak to Lawley's decision-making process, Feat. They had the German propaganda broadcast, which mentioned wounded crew members but might be fabrication, Feat. They had the regulations, Feat, which clearly stated that an aircraft commander's primary duty was to his mission and his crew. In that order, Feat. But what happened when those duties conflicted? The verdict came swiftly: guilty of deviation from assigned mission, Feat. Guilty of unauthorized surrender of military equipment, guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer. Feat recommended sentence: dishonorable discharge, loss of all pay and benefits. Feat, 10 years military prison upon repatriation. The verdict was filed, sealed, fee and set aside to be executed after the war. But war, that great revealer of truth, had not finished with William Lawley's story. In May 1945, when Allied forces liberated Stalag Luft 3 feet, Lawley and his crew emerged from captivity weighing an average of 30 pounds, less than their capture weight feet. They emerged with frostbite scars from the winter of 1944 feet, when the camp's heating had failed and men froze to death in their bunks feet. They emerged with the psychological weight of 800 days, spent wondering if each morning would bring liberation or execution. They also emerged with something the court martial panel had never considered: the testimony of German guards and medical officers feet, who had documented the condition of the warrior's crew when they landed. The navigator had died of his wounds despite immediate medical attention feet. The bombardier had been dead for 20 minutes before landing feet. Lawley himself had been bleeding from 17 separate shrapnel wounds feet, with one piece of steel lodged against his spine, a position that meant any hard impact, such as a parachute landing feet, would have severed his spinal cord and left him paralyzed. The German medical report, translated by U.S. feet. Army intelligence concluded the aircraft commander's decision to attempt a controlled landing feet, rather than order bailout, was medically sound. At least 3 crew members would not have survived parachute egress feet. The commander himself would have been permanently paralyzed. In August 1945 feet, 3 months after Lawley's return to the United States feet, the sealed court martial verdict was presented to his commanding officer for execution. That officer feet, now Colonel Richard Stevens, who had lost 40% of his bomber group over Tunisia, read the file in silence. Then he picked up his pen and wrote a single sentence across the verdict page: recommendation feet. All charges dismissed, officer to be commended for valor. The commendation arrived in November. The Medal of Honor feet, the nation's highest military decoration, was presented to First Lieutenant William Lawley, Jr. on February 8, 1946 feet, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The citation made no mention of the court-martial feat. It described his actions as heroic leadership and outstanding flying skill that saved the lives of his crew members. The reversal was so complete, so absolute, that it erased the contradiction at its heart feat. The same action cannot be both treason and heroism. But war, that great simplifier, had rendered the question moot. Feet, Lawley had been court-martialed for choosing his crew over his mission. He had been decorated for choosing his crew over his life. In the years that followed, military historians would debate which verdict was correct. The regulation seemed clear feat. A pilot's duty was to the mission first. But the medal seemed equally clear: a pilot's duty was to his men always feat. The contradiction was never resolved because it was, perhaps, unresolvable feat. It existed in that gray space where law and morality diverge, where the manual meets the man feat, where duty encounters love. The symbolic weight of that landing, that treasonous, heroic, impossible landing, echoed through American military culture for decades. It became a teaching case at the Air Force Academy feat, presented without resolution, a moral puzzle designed to break cadets' certainty. It became a bar story, told and retold until the details blurred into legend feat. It became a quiet standard against which other men measured their own courage, and found themselves wanting feet, because what Lawley had done required more than bravery. Bravery was flying into flak curtains. Bravery was manning your gun while the aircraft burned feet. What Lawley had done required something rarer and more terrible feet. The willingness to be called a coward in order to save lives feet. To accept the label of traitor rather than abandon wounded men, to choose a future of shame over a present of death feet. The Germans, studying captured American airmen, had concluded that Americans were reckless, undisciplined feet, unwilling to accept casualties for strategic gain. They were wrong feet. What they mistook for recklessness was a different calculation, a different arithmetic feat. Americans calculated in lives, not missions. They measured success in men who came home, not objectives achieved feat. It was inefficient, tactically questionable, and, to the Prussian mind, sentimentally foolish feat. It was also why America won feat. Because a military that values its men above its missions creates men willing to die for those missions feat. A military that treats its soldiers as expendable creates soldiers who spend their lives carefully feat, hoarding them against the moment of maximum strategic value. Lawley's landing, that treasonous, magnificent landing feat, represented the paradox at the heart of American military power. We fight as if each life is infinitely precious feat, and therefore men give their lives freely feat. The recurring symbol throughout this story is not a weapon or an object, but a choice. The moment when doctrine meets humanity, when the manual encounters the man. Lawley's hands on the yoke feat, flying a dead aircraft toward an enemy airfield feat, represent every moment when American soldiers have chosen to value life over victory feat, have chosen to bring their people home, even when home was a POW camp, even when home was a court-martial, even when home was a grave. In the end, feat. The story of William Lawley's landing is not about a pilot who committed treason feat. It is about a system that could call the same action both treason and heroism, and ultimately, slowly, painfully, feat through the crucible of evidence and time, chose heroism feat. It is about a military culture that enshrined in regulations the primacy of mission, but encoded in its soul the primacy of men feat. It is about the democracy that created such a military, that sent its sons to war with the impossible instruction to win the war, but bring everyone home feat. To achieve victory, but at minimum cost, to kill the enemy but value every friendly life as irreplaceable feat. It is about the landing gear that wouldn't extend, the hydraulics that failed, the co-pilot whose face was no longer a face feat, and the 800-yard skid across an enemy runway that saved 7 lives and ended 1 career, and then restored that career because feat. In the end, America decided that saving lives was worth breaking rules. It is about how feat. On that bright January morning over Tunisia, feat. In the moment when the manual said to fly east and his dying men needed west. William Lawley turned the yoke and chose treason. And how, in choosing treason feat, he defined loyalty more perfectly than any regulation ever could. The landing was impossible feat. The court-martial was inevitable. The medal was just feat. And in that tangle of contradictions lies something true about the nation that produces men who land burning bombers at enemy airfields to save their crews feat, and then pins medals on them for committing treason. Because some truths are too large for regulations to contain feat. Some duties too sacred for manuals to define. Some landings too necessary to call surrender